Good morning and welcome to The Rock, Pinetown. The title of my message is When God Delays. I looked up that word delay, and the dictionary says postpone or detain. So when God postpones something, or when God detains something, it's quite a challenge for us when we face a delay from the Lord. I get given a lot of books, thank you, Lynn, and while adding them to my collection of books, I found this little book. I see I had it for a good few years. It was the title that got my attention, When the Roof Caves In. It's not on buildings and structures. In fact, it says, for many who read this book, the whole roof of life has cascaded down in a heap of rubble. When the roof caves in. It's a book with about 18 chapters. My type of book, you can read 3 or 4 chapters, put it down, and then pick it up and carry on. The 9th chapter was the one that really interested me. The title is, Where is God When It Hurts? Where is God when it hurts? This is a testimony of a couple who were missionaries in Malaysia. Their name was James and Jill Stedford. And while working in Asia, James began feeling ill. His condition deteriorated, and during the night, Jill was jolted awake by a heavy thud. James had fallen out of bed and was writhing on the floor, gasping for breath. James was showing signs of viral meningitis. Please, God, don't let him die, shouted Jill. She ran to neighbors, and they managed to get James on a makeshift stretcher, into a boat and across a river, into a waiting ambulance. Day after day passed, and James grew worse. His fever and his suffering increased. One long day after another. Each moment was a prolonged agony for Jill. Her emotions hit an all-time high. She was in a foreign hospital with an apparently dying husband. She wanted to know how long before he turned the corner and started to improve, or if he would. It's very, very difficult to be in an extended crisis, isn't it? An extended crisis. It's very, very difficult. One long day after another is filled with moments of stress, anxiety, yes, perhaps even anger, sadness, hopelessness, a toxic brew, bubbling emotions that starts, in fact, to eat us, yes, alive from the inside out. I'm pleased to tell you that James did turn the corner, and he was able to return to England and did make a full recovery. But that event was never ever forgotten by that family. James and Jill shared this story in the chapter and the book that I mentioned, When the Roof Caves In, their chapter, Where is God When It Hurts? And their final answer in the last paragraph, He was with us then, too. He was with us then, too. It takes a while, in fact, to fully understand that type of situation. And yes, at some time in every life, a person finds himself, herself, in, yes, a dark tunnel where there is no light visible. And as they say, it's not the train coming the other way. You either weep or you cry out in frustration and, yes, plead, Lord, I can't take this anymore. I have no more patience and no more strength to hold out. I must hear from you today. If you don't resolve this issue, Lord, I don't know what I'm going to do. Can you not see, Lord, that I'm desperate? Can you not see, Lord, that I'm desperate? Why don't you help me? Lord, why don't you help me? Many of us have been there. Some, of course, may even be there right now. It may have been or is because of a long, drawn-out sickness. It may have been a long-term financial problem. It may have been a struggle with grief. Perhaps, yes, you're suffering a problem at work, this demanding, unreasonable boss, or a jealous, spiteful fellow worker of whom you have to cope with every day, with no resolution in sight. And before you know it, you find yourself in David's shoes. We all know about David because of his killing of Goliath in the 23rd Psalm. But you find yourself in David's shoes, and you begin to understand his heartfelt words and emotions. David, he is a hero. He's a man of God. He's a man after God's own heart. Yet, he is a man of anguish and suffering. Yes, even given over to the depths of depression. And he cries out to God. Psalm 13. He cries out to God in Psalm 13. I'll just read the first verse, Psalm 13, and I'm reading from the New King James translation. How long, Lord? How long, Lord? David's boyhood had been that of a shepherd boy and just one of several sons in a large family. But what a fateful turn his life had taken. From the moment David killed Goliath, David himself found himself as a hunted man. One moment David was the toast of the nation. The next, he was a young man hiding in caves. The king, the insecure and temperamental Saul, King Saul, was bitterly jealous of David. Saul's reputation as a king had plummeted. And of course, the shepherd boy, his shares had skyrocketed. The women of Israel celebrated the victory of David over Goliath by singing a song which we find in 1 Samuel 18 verse 7. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. If you were the king, would you like to hear such a melody echoing through the streets? It was an intolerable situation for an emotional, egotistical monarch. And Saul eyed David from that day forth. Verse 9 says, and Saul eyed David from that day. There's a reference in the Bible that I was reading. It says, viewed David with suspicion. Viewed David with suspicion. Saul saw David through the blurry green lens of jealousy, which had become Saul's obsession. We often forget that David was a fugitive for 8 to 9 years. We forget that David lived on the run from the very country where he was a national hero. Furthermore, David's life and his plight in life were very complicated by all kinds of personal entanglements. For instance, King Saul, David's ultimate enemy, the same ruthless king whose life was dedicated to hunting David down and yes, killing him. Saul was also the father of a son, Jonathan, David's blood brother. He was also the father of a daughter who had stolen David's heart, Jonathan and King Saul's daughter. Can you imagine a more complicated personal scenario than that. During these 8 or 9 years, David had to remain constantly on the move. He lived in fields, he lived in forests, in caves, even in the desert. Finally, David was chased out of the land of Israel and into the very midst of the Philistines, the enemy whose hero he had killed. David ended up in a city called Gath, but the locals identified David very quickly. And the only way David could think of escape was to act as if he'd lost his mind. Scripture tells us that in order to get away from Achish, the king of Gath, David dribbled in his beard, scratched his hands on the doors, and gave the most convincing impression that he could be insane. 1 Samuel 21, we read that story about David and his insanity. 1 Samuel 21, and I'm going to read from verses 10 to 14. We'll find it. Then David rose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dancing, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? Now David took those words to heart and was very much afraid Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, pretended madness in the hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall on his beard. Then Achish said to the servant, Look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen that you have brought this fellow to play a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow not come into my house? He escaped by pretending to be insane. Later, of course, David moved on. He had 600 men that supported him. They were faithful to King David. David settled in a place called Ziklag. There he managed to live peaceably for about 16 months. But one day, he, together with the 600 men, left on a military mission. When David returned home, the city of Ziklag had been burned to the ground. The wives and the children of the men that left behind had been carried away, including David's own family. David's men were grief-stricken, but also filled with fury. They turned their anger on David, and they threatened to stone him to death. It was all David's fault. That's the way they saw it. As far as they were concerned, David, their leader, had cost them their wives and their children. And you can read that story for yourselves in 1 Samuel 30. David had lost his own family, and he was blamed for the loss of hundreds of others and their children. And now he faced death by stoning. And out of the pain in his heart, David cried out to the Lord. And out of desperation, we read Psalm 13. We read that Psalm 13, and I'm going to read it through. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and hear me, O Lord, my God. Enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest my enemy say, I have prevailed against him, lest those who trouble me rejoice when I am moved. But I have trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, because he has dealt bountifully with me. David wrote that psalm when he was physically exhausted and, yes, emotionally depressed. David's troubles with King Saul had gone on year after year after year. David was dispirited, he was discouraged. The psalm sounds like him wringing out his very soul. David simply could not go on. It's in those occasions when God delays that we struggle with God's timing. When God delays, we struggle with God's timing. It's good to know, having read those scriptures, that those feelings didn't originate with us. Because not only did David express the feelings that we've had, but he repeated them. He repeated them. If you read through the book of Psalms, and we heard some Psalms this morning, you will find many, many, many times that Psalms begin with a sigh and they end with a song. But in life, you see, we can't take in the song without letting out the sigh. And just as the song that we sing has a refrain, the psalm has a refrain, a recurring phrase that always comes back around. And this time in that psalm, it's the words, how long? 4 times we read those 2 words in Psalm 13. How long, Lord? David's overwhelmed with a sense of the permanence of trouble. 8 to 9 years. It was just going on and on and on. Trouble springs up when we least want it. At times it seems to have no solution. Trouble seems to mock our most diligent efforts to lead a happy and peaceful Christian life. Of course, what happens, it finally consumes the last ounce of our patience. And David, much like you and I, finally lifts his eyes, yes, in exasperation and says, how much longer, Lord? How much longer? That is very personal. That is very personal. I know I've asked the Lord, and I'm sure there's many here, may even be asking him now, how much longer, Lord? Somewhere in the scheme of your suffering, yes, you begin to give up on God. What you believe is, of course, that God has given up on you. Just let me remind you and remember very clearly, that is an impossibility. God never, ever gives up on you or I. Never, ever. God never, ever gives up. He never ceases to care about you, and he will not abandon his work in and through you. God does not, in fact, he cannot forget you or I. No matter what storm you are weathering in life, you have never left God's mind or heart. Psalm 13 is so filled with misery, but note that it builds to a final note of triumph. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. There's nothing strange about that. That's the way faith should work. We come to God honestly, pour out our hearts to him, and experience. Yes, it is an experience. Renewed faith as he prods our memory. God continues to prod our memory. Yes, comes in the form of our conscience. And he reaffirms his love for us. There's this great hymn, and I know we have sung it here. I've just taken some of the words out of it. Count your blessings, name them, one by one. Count your blessings, see what God has done. Count them, see what God has done. In the Old Testament, there's a story of a prophet called Habakkuk. He lived at a time when the people of God lived in rebellion against God's holy principles. Habakkuk was a prophet. He was called to confront the wickedness of God's people. And yet he stood and he cried out to God. If we look at that, Habakkuk, chapter 1 of Habakkuk. Here's the first verse. O Lord, how long shall I cry out and you will not hear? Does that not sound like Psalm 13? How long? How long, Lord, shall I cry out and you will not hear? Even I cry out to you, violence, and you will not save. He was concerned for God's people. He was the prophet to go and tell God's people that what they were doing was not of God. How long, Lord, are you going to let them get away with it? Of course, God was saying to him, take a good look around and you figure it out. Take a good look around and you figure it out. When I read that, I thought, that's quite true. At times in my life, if I take a good look around, I need to try and figure it out, because somewhere in the mix is me. Somewhere in the mix is me. You know, we talk about the song, I Did It My Way. Me. There's the problem at times. I'm in the mix. Habakkuk finally came to this conclusion. He was perplexed, very perplexed, that God, yes, is God, and that God's ways are not our ways. And that's when Habakkuk wrote these words in chapter 3. Habakkuk chapter 3. He's come through a huge challenge. He's not happy with God's answer, but we pick it up from Habakkuk 3, verse 17. It says in this translation, a hymn of faith. A hymn of faith. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit on the vines, though the labor of the olives may fall, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. And here's this lovely word, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on high hills. Yet will I rejoice in the Lord. Conclusions, choices face each and every one of us. Of course, we can demand from God all the answers. We may, Lord, just neatly wrap them for us. Just neatly gift wrap them. We can insist that God quickly resolve every trial and, yes, injustice in our life. Or, of course, we can choose. We can choose to lift our eyes, yes, to the heavens, put out our hearts to God, and say, in the midst of our grief, and yes, maybe even our anger, God, I have no clue what this turmoil is all about or where it is leading. But this is my decision. I will put my trust in you, and I will praise you with all my heart, unconditionally, irrespective of the circumstances, unconditionally. I will praise you with all my heart. The same God who's been there for you and I in the past is the same God who is going to be there for us in the future. He will bring resolution in his own time, according to his own purpose. We become preoccupied with our circumstances. God is preoccupied with our character. God is preoccupied with our character. God will allow the tough times for the higher good of our character until he is finished with the great work, which at times is invisible to our earthly eyes. The writer of Psalm 13 concludes, and this is taken from the NIV translation, I will sing to the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. I trust that you have learned the joy of singing praise to God when God delays. Amen.